for or by our farmers and growers, whether it's well conversed or not, it always does have a flow-on effect in some way, shape or form. I'm your host, Sarah Perriam, and I'm so proud on behalf of my team in 2021 to bring you this new concept called Opinion Maker, which is proving to be in popularity with you, our audience. And over the next hour, we will have another fantastic 4 guests with 2 on a panel to close the show, and always around one topic. Now, we're also very proud to welcome our partnership with the Opinion Maker this week with Farmlands. As Farmlands see the value of being a part of the conversation that is affecting their shareholders as we all grapple with embracing change. Now, the major change that's having a flow-on effect is the intensive winter grazing regulations under the current national environmental standards for freshwater, which is being met with frustration and concern by many farmers. The details of the regulation, from the sowing dates, pugging depth, and whether or not you've got a grazing history on your property, is highlighting that our winter feeding systems into the future are going to look very different. So I want to deep dive into that. How different are they going to look, and what does it mean for not only the value of our rural land, but the profitability of the farming businesses on top of them, and the nutritional impact also on our livestock. Now, I've started another concept for you if you've been following along with Sarah's Country. On the Sarah's Country Facebook page, I've started a group called the Sarah's Country Brains Trust, and I want you, our audience, to be actively a part of crowdsourcing the thoughts, opinions, as well as guide the direction of the topics that we discuss on Sarah's Country. Yes, my name may be in the title. However, this show is all about your voice and hearing from those that are being extremely progressive in our industry, but also those that it affects. So if you are into being a part of actively your opinion and want to drive the conversation forward, head over to Sarah's Country on Facebook and find the group, and it's called Sarah's Country Brains Trust, and I invite you all to come along and join it as well. One thing that I've got is exclusive first access to the content on that group before it goes live on podcasts. So make sure you check out that soon. Now, who is coming up in this Opinion Maker, you ask? I can hear. Kicking off, we have Ben Turner from Bayleys Canterbury. I heard from Ben at a recent event in Canterbury. One thing I do love about living here is the amount of great events with wonderful speakers giving their thoughts on and from their angle within the industry. And Ben Turner talked about the flow-on effect he's seeing with the winter grazing rules on properties' interest from buyers and the due diligence level that is now going on into these properties. So Ben is going to join us shortly to paint the picture on the flow-on effect of the winter grazing rules on values here in Canterbury. And Dr Rob Derrick from Farmlands is a head of animal nutrition and health. He's also spoken at an event that I was emceeing at AgFest and provided some really great insights into supplementary feed options and the flow-on of the nitrogen limits in terms of the dry matter we can produce. Is he fearful of us running out of feed domestically? And what will that mean to the nutritional impact on our dairy cows? So, yeah, the great advice of Dr. Rob Derrick coming up in the show. And to close, the Southland Advisory Group has made a call to the government collectively with Dairy NZ to take a deeper dive into the consequences of the rules. They've been constructively working with government as a group across the board with Fish and Game and Environment Southland to prove the fact that some of these rules are simply impractical. We understand the government will have a response in the coming weeks around this, but I really want to know what the experience has been like dealing with government from the Southland farmers that have dedicated their time voluntarily to ensure that it is of benefit to all. Bernadette Hunt, Vice President for Federated Farmers, will be on the panel with the Southland Advisory Group member and dairy farmer from Southland, Paul Turner. So really looking forward to that towards the end of this Opinion Maker show. So sit back over the next hour as we uncover from every angle around the impact of the intensive winter grazing rules and everything you need to know. But let's kick it off after this very short break with Bayleys Canterbury Director Ben Turner.
This is Sarah's Country, produced in alliance with Farmers Weekly, the place New Zealand farmers turn to for a trusted source of in-depth agricultural journalism. Stay connected to the matters that matter most by subscribing to My Daily Digest at farmersweekly.co.nz.
Oh, nice boots.
Yeah, thanks. They're new.
Ben, you alright?
Oh, yeah, sorry, mate. Just meerkatting pretty hard, eh? Yeah. I just said to myself, Ben, work hard. You deserve new boots.
Kicking us off in this week's Opinion Maker show around the topic of winter feed systems going into the future. I heard from our first guest at a recent New Zealand Institute for Primary Industry Management event here in Christchurch. I tell you what, if you're not signed up to it, if you're a member of the rural, working in the industry and supporting farmers and growers, please do sign up because they have some very, very valuable events and webinars at the NZIPM. And speaking on sort of the state of the rural real estate in Canterbury in particular, was Bayleys Canterbury Director Ben Turner, and he highlighted a lot of the flow-on effects of these freshwater regulations are having because of the percentage of winter grazing on property that you can have going forward, as well as the history of winter grazing impacting on buyer demand for certain properties. And Ben joins us now. Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to add to the discussion around this. Could you please give a little bit of a background around what these rules are and what you're seeing the flow-on consequences of buyer demand?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah, for having us on this evening. It really comes down to it will have an impact as we go forward and move into these new regulations on values of some of these farms, particularly your sheep and beef farms that are looking to a new buyer maybe wishing to transition into dairy support. Essentially, I guess, we're not the experts in it, and it's our job to give people advice on who the experts are to talk to when they're making these decisions. However, really, sheep and beef, that if you haven't got that high nitrogen cap already, my understanding is that if you are, you're essentially going to be first in line for consent to winter graze and to be able to continue to do that, or a big land use change of some sort. Or obviously it needs to take into account the soil types and are you next to any sensitive areas like rivers or lakes or anything that would also impact your ability to get consent to go ahead and winter graze. And obviously the 10% thing's quite simple and straightforward. So we'll have an impact because some buyers looking at these properties either just won't be able to make them work from a cash flow point of view to be able to go in and purchase them, cash flow to pay their mortgages and get themselves up and running and get into farming for those first few years. That's traditionally how Canterbury has evolved over the last 15 to 20 years with a number of dairy farm conversions, which has actually allowed people to grow their farming and establish their families in the farming environment through that. So that is going to become more restrictive, which will restrict potentially competition for farms, which would have an impact on value.
And we're seeing that with some very high prices. What are some of those fundamentals that buyers are looking for in sort of that more sort of A+ dairy farm operation? What are they doing that's ticking those boxes to getting close up to 50,000 a hectare?
Look, what's happening there is that those farmers are spending the time. So it's not about, from our point of view, it's about us giving them the best advice. It's about understanding what's required or what those buyers will require straight off the bat as soon as they see that farm advertised. So it's not rushing out, putting the farm on the market a week after having a look at it. It's really getting all that information required. Most importantly are obviously, can they actually, the figures we're giving them on what that dairy farm is producing currently and the cow numbers they're running, can they do that into the future, or where are their reductions at and what do they have to do? And that's looked at through obviously their baselines and what they might have to do around carrying capacity, and also their nitrogen cap, usage of nitrogen at the moment, and how that's being managed to meet the new requirements. so that production can stay the same. And to be fair, look, a lot of our farmers have been working with us for many, many years, and there's not a whole lot of farms that we are putting on the market or looking at now that aren't already within those caps and have been working to minimising that nitrogen use whilst keeping their production up.
What does this mean for the traditional runoff block and dairy grazing?
Well, it's such an important part of the region to get through, and obviously the cows have got to graze somewhere. We have seen more, and it's probably more driven out of perhaps in times when the dairy payout is lower and people are looking at their costs and perhaps more wintering on, and it's evolving into that more. I think we're probably a wee bit more fortunate in Canterbury because we've had such an evolving dairy sector for the last 20 years that we've got a lot of properties that have historically winter grazed. It will be more for those that haven't, that are looking to land use change, that will have the biggest impact. But from what we hear on the ground, I don't believe there's a massive shortage out there of dairy grazing in there at this stage, but certainly for other parts of the country it will have a huge impact, particularly Southland, obviously.
From an interview I had last night from Dana Muir from BNZ, Head of Natural Capital, and the concept of natural capital that the financial institutions are now banking on and making part of their risk assessment when they're looking at investing in dairy farms across New Zealand. Natural capital is actually a valuable thing now, isn't it? And could you qualify how people are bringing that into their due diligence?
Look, the reality is, no, it is hard to quantify. It is another factor that I think is making up due diligence. The reality is, though, I think the fact is that it's really driving more so is people's, well, from a funding point of view, is their ability to pay that money back now, as we know. I think there's overriding factors that is part of it, but there's probably bigger things that we're seeing that are in their due diligence is basically around, can they run that same farming operation and produce what that farm is producing now in 2 years' time, which is a bit of a guesstimate because there's still a bit of betting in. I think there's still a wee bit of uncertainty as to how the national rules will overlay with our regional plan, and that's still being worked through. But it is, it is a factor in it, but not something that I can actually categorically quantify for you, unfortunately.
And everyone always wants to know the makeup of the current buyers of these high dairy land values. Is Canterbury going to become the land of the corporate farm?
No, look, I think we've got a good mix across the board of corporate and family. What we're seeing is a very diverse range of buyers, anywhere from family groups that are looking to expand, corporate to a certain point, but those corporates are made up of sort of one or two families that run a very good structure and are looking to expand. No, look, I think we've got a whole range of buyers. What is interesting is that we are hearing from a lot of new buyers that we've never had in the market that are inquiring about dairy. They are looking for simple operations, asking about dairy farms if they were leased out, who would operate them, how all that works. But there is certainly a push, and there's been a major push in the last 12 months for a number of people that have traditionally invested in commercial properties, possibly even shares and things like that, that are turning to the dairy sector now and have confidence to invest. And like, the reality is there is so much expertise within that sector, and people's ability within that expertise to manage these farms for them, it can be kept a very simple asset. So I think we have got a really diverse range from mum and dad investors and people coming out of different business sectors that generate high cash flows, that are looking, they feel secure with the land-based operation. But it's interesting you say that, because the farms that they're really attracted to are those traditional real estate things: good location, good soils, underpinned by good water, that potentially in 20 years' time, these are all long-term investors. If it's not a dairy farm, it could grow vegetables or have different land uses. So they're still driven off the back of quality assets. But in saying that, look, they're prepared to pay for them too.
And I just want to end on a sideline conversation I had with someone at that event a couple of weeks ago in Christchurch was, isn't it interesting now how the Central Plains water wasn't understood and was going to be a very expensive scheme for people to buy into, is now absolutely transpiring in values because of not just the water security, but also the environmental management plans that went around that water as well, that makes it easier, as you've just said, for those buyers.
Absolutely, that's right. It just gives you a much better chance of affecting land use change, and that might be going from a dairy support to a vegetable growing or a cropping scenario and things like that. I think people are understanding that, the value of having your environmental side of your farming operation taken care of under that regime. And look, the most recent sales we've seen of land within that CPW area have been very solid and back up where they were 2 or 3 years ago. So that's showing good confidence in it. And those sales are coming from that dairy support point of view, which is interesting because it gives you the ability to affect land use change on perhaps land that is currently irrigated but hasn't necessarily been used for dairy support. So there are very few areas within the Canterbury region that you can do that now under the new rules. So those benefits are really showing through. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Bayleys Canterbury Director Ben Turner there, talking to us around the flow-on and the action and reaction of winter grazing practices, seeing a few more wintering on scenarios. And after the break, we're going to continue on that discussion with Farmland's Head of Nutrition and Animal Health, Dr Rob Derrick, around his wealth of knowledge and how a balance of feed options into the future with supplementary feed will be necessary with the decrease in feed produced from properties around New Zealand based on the winter grazing rules. All that up next here on Sarah's Country.
This is Sarah's Country. Catch the latest on the matters that matter most wherever you are. Listen to Sarah's Country on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple or Google Podcasts. Try asking Alexa or Siri. Play Sarah's Country on podcast.
One of the first things you learn when you live out here
is where to shop for the things you need to live out here.
like electric fencing,
or horse feed,
or bee suits,
children,
chook food.
Do you want a couple of these?
Or something stylish to wear. Not everyone's got stuff like this.
But at Farmlands we do, and then some.
So if you need anything to help you farm,
grow, milk, dredge,
rear, come on in.
Because we're out here too.
Well, while the intensive winter grazing regulations may take some time to bed in, it's worth taking a longer term view of where we want to be as a country, balancing our climate change targets, our water quality aspirations, and our vulnerability on producing domestically our feed for our livestock, as well as imported feed. Joining us now is Farmland's Head of Nutrition and Animal Health, Dr Rob Derrick, with his wealth of knowledge on alternative feed options and supplementary feed in our current management practices, but also what a reduction on nitrogen inputs, part of the freshwater rules, will have as a flow-on effect. Thank you so much, Rob, for taking the time to join us here. I had the pleasure of learning from you at AgFest when we had a Farmlands panel around embracing change going forward, and I learnt certainly a lot more around alternative feed options. I thought it would be an ideal opportune time to have those conversations whilst we have the ongoing effect of the freshwater rules coming into play on the 1st of May. Could you set the scene for us around what you're seeing at the moment in your role as farmers try to understand how they will produce more from less?
I think there's just certainly a big concern or a move towards being more sustainable. And I think when we think about sustainability, we've got to think that sustainability occurs at different levels. There's financial sustainability of the farmers, and they need to make profits or they're not going to be there to produce milk. There's a nutritional sustainability for the consumers that are eating the diet. They want a product which will support well-being in terms of body and mind. we've got to think about sustainability in terms of the Paris Agreement, which calls for a reduction in greenhouse gases, but not at the expense of food production, because the global population is forecast to increase from nearly 8 billion to 10 billion in the next 30 years. And we know that discerning customers want good animal welfare and less pollution. So with all these factors going on, there's lots of things for farmers to think about. And that's why I'm pleased that Farmers has set up this new growth innovation team, and we're looking sort of 4 or 5 years out to try to give farmers the information they need to take things forward.
I want to start with the nitrogen cap. So 190 kilos of nitrogen per hectare is what the new rules are. But with this becomes a lost feed situation that has to come from somewhere. How do you believe that will have a flow-on effect to ensure that we maintain the right nutrient levels within our dairy herd?
I think there's lots of things that farmers can do, and as a cooperative, we're helping farmers to adapt to the nitrogen cap, which only looks like it's going to affect about 15% of farmers nationwide. So it's not spread evenly across the country, but certainly in those regions where high rates of nitrogen have been used, the farmers have got a wide range of options to try to mitigate that. Such as, in some cases, people might just be using nitrogen not very efficiently, using it at the wrong time of year and using it and not getting a very good response. On the pasture side, we've got mitigation techniques like N-boost and gibberellic acid to try to boost grass growth. But if people do cut back on fertiliser nitrogen, it does equate to a loss in dry matter production. If we still want to feed the world and produce the same amount of milk, you can't get more out than you put in. So one option is to fill that gap with imported feeds. And I think that's quite a legitimate use. It's almost like recycling. We're basically using byproducts from the human food industry and from biofuel production. And the more and more I look at it, I see that New Zealand is probably one of the best places on the world to keep cows. The environment we've got, the ability to grow grass, is just second to none. So we are very efficient, but we know that by feeding those cows to sustain high levels of production, we can actually get better efficiency in terms of greenhouse gas, the carbon footprint per kilogram of milk solids. So I think we need to be quite open that importing byproducts that are produced in parts of the world, such as soya hulls from South America, it's a very good environment for growing soya. It's not so good for milking cows. And it's the same in New Zealand. We can't grow soya bean because it's not really hot enough, but it's an ideal environment to keep cows, which have got a rumen, which is basically like a central heating boiler inside the body. So they don't cope very well with heat stress. So I think going forward, the case will be made stronger and stronger that feeding cows to support milk production can be good for both the cow, the farmer, and the environment.
What about our vulnerability of moving to more alternative feed options than pasture, grain, palm kernel, soy husks, and particularly, say, for instance, with grain in our mission here in the arable industry to produce, 100% sustainability around our wheat for bread, and the effect that will have on animal feed and grains into the livestock industry, the sort of consumer trend around the use of palm kernel and Fonterra's stance on that as well. What's your thoughts on that?
I think that shipping products around the world in bulk ships is very efficient. You can take product a long way on a ship because it's on water. It's a very efficient mode of transport. And I think greenhouse gases are global. You know, the greenhouse gases we produce will have an effect on other people elsewhere in the world. And it's logical to think of the globe as an entity. And if we can make use of byproducts from around the world and use them in a very efficient farming system, then I think that makes sense. But there will be more and more competition. We're seeing China is getting more dairy cows, and they're paying more now for some of these byproducts. So it is a competitive environment. But I think because we've got such an efficient pasture-based system, we should be able to buy those traits at the level that they're making on the world market, and vice versa for the grain growers. Farmlands has got 2 feed mills. We support a lot of shareholders that produce grain. We're putting it into the feed industry. That grain probably won't be sold at global prices. We can't compete against the big Australian wheat growers and the North American wheat growers. So I think we need a diverse farming system, and that's one of the things about Farmlands. We're very agnostic. We'll support shareholders whatever they want to do. If they want to grow hops, or if they want to grow kiwi fruit, we will try to support that. And I think a mixed farming system is great going forward, because it spreads the risk and it plays to our strengths. And if kiwi fruit grows better in the Bay of Plenty, particularly if it gets warmer, and dairy cows are more efficient in Southland, then it makes sense that we might see more cows in Southland and more kiwi fruit in the Bay of Plenty. If Northland can grow bananas and people want to pay for bananas, then we'll see more bananas being grown. So that sustainability is an economic thing, and the economics will determine what farmers do. But ultimately, the world wants food, and I think we've got to be very a little bit more vocal that our dairy products are part of a healthy, nutritious diet that is good for people all around the world, really. And that's why people are paying a premium for our milk. I'm not sure if that's answered the question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot more of a wider global view of our food systems and how they're also integrated, and how by New Zealand having its own domestic regulations, it's not that straightforward. So no, you definitely did answer that. Thank you. And when it comes...
understand that continuous intensive cereal cropping is not great for the soil. So when people talk about regenerative farming, the beauty of a pasture-based system is that grass is seen as a way forward to capture carbon from the atmosphere and put it back into the soil. And as part of a rotation, arable crops and long-term grassland is a great option. So I'm really encouraged that what we're doing ticks a lot of the boxes going forward.
Yeah, no, fair point, absolutely. Before you go, I just want to talk about the rise in maize silage and lifted fodder beet domestically produced in New Zealand, and the balance that we're getting around making sure that we have the right nutrition and cow condition in New Zealand, and what your advice and thoughts are on how we can balance, the intensive winter grazing systems that we have across the country and our environmental outcomes, as well as ensuring that we don't lose our nutritional outcomes as well.
I think New Zealand dairy farmers are doing a lot right. I think they're doing a superb job, but with everything, you can always do a little bit better. And I think crops like fodder beet are a very high yielding crop, produce a high yield of dry matter, and they do have a great ability to put cow condition on. So it has been a great solution. But with the intensive winter grazing reforms, that acreage might have to be pared back a bit. If farmers can only grow 10% of the farm, we might see that particularly some of the winter graziers that are focused on winter grazing dry cows won't be able to grow so much fodder beet. So if we're looking at less fodder beet, which has been doing a good job, what's the alternative? And my focus really is on feeding the cows in mid to late lactation to support milk production, but also body condition. So the good thing about dairy cows, if you feed them for extra milk production, it increases appetite. And if they've got a higher appetite, when they come to petition energy on the back, they petition a bigger slice of that dry matter intake onto weight gain. So you can literally have your cake and eat it too in terms of feeding cows. So we tend to find that people that feed the cows more supplements in mid to late lactation have got cows in better condition and they produce more milk. The key thing with cows is you've got to dry them off with a view to the condition of calving. So calving condition is paramount to the season ahead. So if you can dry your cows off in better condition, you've got a shorter dry period. So inevitably there's going to be less need for dry cow feeds, whether that be fodder feed or winter grazing. And while the cow's milking, you're also putting milk in the vat, which is generating profit. So more and more surveys are showing that supplementary feeding is good for the farmer's bank balance and it's good for the cow. So it's a win-win all round. And the other thing is that when you look at greenhouse gases, there was a survey in 2017-18 that showed the top 25% of farmers surveyed in terms of greenhouse gases per kilogram of milk solids use more supplementary feed than the lower quartile. And it's not necessarily cause and effect, but basically what that survey shows is that you can feed cows high level of supplements and have a lower carbon footprint. So it's a win-win all round, really, in terms of profitability, the environment and the cow. Because a cow that's in better condition, that calves down in the right condition, is more likely to have less metabolic issues, she's more likely to get pregnant, and she's more likely to have a longer life in the herd.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's Dr. Rob Derrick there. So what I'm hearing is that there is a lot of efficiencies that we haven't quite found just yet that have a great flow-on effect all round, and their alternative supplementary feeds is all part of a balanced diet, and it also is one of the major answers to the changes we're seeing to our intensive winter grazing regulations. So, yeah, absolutely appreciate your time. Dr. Rob Derrick there, the head of animal nutrition at Farmlands Cooperative. And now after the break, we have Southland Advisory Group member and dairy farmer Paul Turner and Southland Federated Farmers Vice President and sheep and beef farmer Bernadette Hunt on our panel discussion on the future of winter feed systems as we unpack their calls to government for changes to the freshwater regulations, but I believe it has been after constructive consultation with government.
This is Sarah's Country. Join the conversation. Have thoughts on an interview? Or have you got questions you want answered by a future guest? Let us know. Email sarah@sarahscountry.com.
Well, when asked by a government spokesperson in response to a call by Southland farmers to make changes to winter grazing rules by the Southland Advisory Group, their response was to Neil Wallace in Farmers Weekly this week is we're pleased farming leaders and others in the group accept that intensive winter grazing practices need to improve, and we are working constructively with them to achieve that. Well, is that really true? Acceptance isn't what is happening in the south, as farmers need certainty on the wording within the freshwater policy and want to be heard on the impractical nature of some of the suggested rules. Joining us now on the Opinion Maker panel for this week's topic about future winter feeding systems is two very active members of the Southland farming community currently lobbying the government for change. Southland Advisory Group member and dairy farmer Paul Turner, and Southland Federated Farmers and Vice President for Federated Farmers and Sheep and Beef Farmer Bernadette Hunt. Thank you so much for both of your time. Important there to note that you're both actively farming as well as taking on this challenge voluntarily. So I appreciate your time to come on and discuss this to both of you. Paul, I might start with you in terms of why you embarked on the role of a Southland Advisory Group to help make these changes in the first place.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah. Yeah, well, I guess it all began last year with a meeting we had with the ministers, where a few of us spoke to the ministers about our concerns with their rules they'd put out. And at the conclusion of that meeting, Minister Parker and O'Connor, they sort of opened the door to us to, basically you guys have a crack and come back to us with something. But if you do, we don't just want a one-sided view of it. We want it to be, cross-sector with all the relevant parties involved and come back to us with something constructive, not just knocking it down. So that's where the group was formed with, so dairy farmer. I'm a dairy farmer. We've got a sheep and beef farmer, Dan through Bernadette, who's a farmer representing Feds, and then we had industry groups of beef and lamb, dairy and Z. We had fish and game and Environment Southland, and also sitting in on the calls we had MPI and the Ministry for the Environment as well. So we had really good buy-in, and everybody was involved in the conversation all the way through. So most of our meetings were over Zoom. It was an extremely busy time of the year when we did our piece of work through the spring. And so we'd meet generally on at least a weekly basis and really set our brief about what we wanted to achieve. And we just really got stuck into our work, and we've come up with our recommendations, which 6 or 7 recommendations there, which probably don't look much, but there was a heap of behind the scenes work that went into that, and just fleshing out the issues. And it was really interesting how some, you think there's two clear sides of the fence there, kind of an us and them. If you looked at it from the outside, with sort of the farming type groups on one side and then the sort of environmental types on the other side, but that just wasn't the case. Everybody was there for the same reason. Like, we all want good water quality, right? We all want to be able to swim in our rivers with our kids and do everything we want to do, and obviously continue to run profitable businesses. So the level of common ground was quite astounding, and especially once we were able to frame it up. And I think it was important, having the farmers there, and obviously and the ones with the scientific sort of background. We could sort of work together on how that different rules would be practical or wouldn't be practical. So it was a good collaborative sort of effort.
So the word constructively actually was true by the sounds of that. So that's actually fantastic to hear. Bernadette, for those who are not familiar with the details of the National Environment Standard for freshwater, why do they not deliver the required quality of regulation to achieve the outcomes?
That's a great question, actually. And the key is that a lot of the rules within the National Environmental Standards aren't focused on the actual freshwater outcome. They impose restrictions on what you do on your land, which don't necessarily flow on to impacts on freshwater. So, for example, a rule that states what date you need to sow your crops by drives farmers to work towards that date, when actually we should be working towards the right weather conditions and the right ground conditions and those kinds of things. So if we put heavy machinery on a paddock that's waterlogged and wet, it does more more damage to the soil, which can result in worse outcomes for water. It might result in a failed crop, which means you then have to go and cultivate it again. So that was a rule that focused on what you do on the land as opposed to focusing on the outcome for water. And the group was very focused on coming up with rules and an approach that was outcomes focused. It was all about the water, not about restricting land use.
And Paul, when it comes to the Pugging Depth in Southland as a dairy farmer, how practical are they for you in circumstances of adverse weather events?
Yeah, well, just basically absolutely not practical, Sarah. And don't get me wrong, there's various parts of Southland that are better than others, and we're in probably what is considered a drier area of Southland. But there's still, you get an inch of rain overnight, and despite your best attempts, 500 kilo animals are going to push into the surface of the ground. It's just as simple as that. So there was a better way, and Bernadette touched on it before. It was outcomes, like what is the actual reason for that rule? And quite clearly, we don't want contaminants getting to waterways, right? So that's where we felt the deletion of the pugging rule, along with the sowing date, which Bernadette touched on, and replacing them with a requirement to protect critical source areas, which is where your contaminant's going to get to waterways, was a far more robust approach. And you couldn't sort of muck it up by that approach. Even people not adopting the best practice, as long as they had those critical source areas protected, you're going to have a much better outcome for freshwater health.
Bernadette, I've got here in the executive summary of your recommendations, and the Dairy New Zealand chair has asked the government to at least respond in good faith that the group has responded. But we've got their 1st of May 2021 deadline looming. Do you strongly believe when they say that they will come out in coming weeks that we will have an outcome in due course very soon?
I'm very hopeful of that. We're hearing some fairly positive messages through, I'm not directly involved in conversations with them in Wellington, but some of our counterparts at Feds are, and some senior people in other organisations are. And the messaging has, the feedback we're getting is that they're being looked on favourably. But as you say, the time is now. The challenge for government is they'll need to put this through cabinet. That a minister can't just sign off on this stuff on his own because it was a cabinet decision to get it out there originally. So presumably it'll need to be another cabinet decision to change it. And I also know that when we first gave them the recommendations, it was the last sitting week of Parliament before Christmas, and then they're largely not on the job again until the beginning of February. So they haven't actually had a lot of time looking at the work. But to be fair, I kind of think they've had enough now, and they need to hurry up. We need to know what's going on so that people can get on with doing what needs to be done.
What's been your biggest learning, Paul, in as a farmer engaging in a process with government, and a government that has proven to be challenging to deal with in communicating and collaborating with the industry, what the right approach is? Because across farming circles, there's certainly been lots of different levels of approach, and everybody has their own opinion around that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Sarah. And I think, we've seen there's a few ginger groups that started up recently, and everyone's entitled to their own thing, and I won't comment on them. But I think the ministers, when we presented our work to them, and we'd given them a couple of updates on the way through when we were doing our piece of work, and we presented before Christmas, they were extremely complimentary about sort of how quickly we'd done the work, but how effective it was, and it was extremely robust because it was coming from all viewpoints. We had everybody in the same room, and we're very conscious as we were going through each rule we were working on that we had unanimous agreement on all of those things. So essentially, when we provided that advice to government and to their officials, we had Environment Southland ticked off, we had Fish and Game ticked off, the farming groups, we were in favour as well. So everybody was across the line on it. Really, it just was there for them to pick up and run with, really. So that was, and so the ministers, they were very impressed by that approach, and they said, well, that could be a good way, in the future to address similar situations. Put a small cross-sector working group on it, and I hate that word working group, but essentially what we were, and get it done, just down and dirty, and get stuck into it and churn out a result, instead of endless head banging, which is what we see with one side coming up with something, another side knocking it down and just banging away. Whereas get everyone in the same room and get it done and achieve an outcome, and it was a lot more successful.
Bernadette, how are Southland farmers feeling, sort of 3 to 5 years on, around farm environment plans, critical source areas, and having some form of certainty around what a desired practical farm management solution could be? And I just want to get an understanding of how far attitudes may have changed or not.
Oh, honestly, I think they've changed hugely. I think most farmers in Southland on the whole are ready for a change of this nature, because the vast majority of farmers are doing a good job, and they are so sick of seeing television coverage of people who are letting the rest of us down. Now, don't get me wrong, some of the coverage that happens on TV and in print media and that kind of stuff is actually tailored to have an effect, and it's possible to take a bad photo of just about anything if you want to frame it in that way. But there are absolutely a few people who are letting the side down, and while most of us have changed our practice and got ahead of regulation requiring us to do it, there are the slower to change people who need this regulation to make it happen. And so the vast majority of Southland farmers are happy to see that happen. But what got brought in last year, unfortunately, was going to penalise even the top farmers and make life very difficult for even the farmers that were well ahead of the game. And so hopefully our recommendations will be accepted, because we're pretty confident that they'll achieve better results without penalising the people that are already doing the job right.
Thank you so much to both of you in a very busy time, and all the hard work that you've been doing voluntarily on behalf of not only Southland farmers, but the flow-on effect this will have to all farmers across the country. And of course, it's Southland farmers leading the way there, because of course they are affected by their location geographically. That is Southland Advisory Group member Paul Turner, dairy farmer in Southland, as well as sheep and beef farmer Bernadette Hunt, and also Vice President of the Southland Federated Farmers. Absolutely incredible work from both of them. Thank you very much for your time. Well, that was actually quite a positive and constructive panel there around the future of our winter feeding systems. And of course, you can read more around the outcome that is being sought for the winter grazing rules in this week's Farmers Weekly, as well as on farmersweekly.co.nz, and a bit of an executive summary on the advisory group's recommendations on the Dairy NZ website as well. So very much thank you. And I continuously say this. As Paul pointed out there, they were doing this work through the busiest time of year, through calving and spring, voluntarily on behalf of our wider farming community. So it's incredible when people do knuckle down and actually do have some constructive engagement with government, that we can potentially, I'm only saying this because yet to find out in coming weeks, hopefully, the outcome around particularly the resowing dates and the pugging rules. Farmers leading change, and we will have more leading change in our Changemaker show. It's live from 7 o'clock tomorrow, Wednesday, on Ceres Country on Facebook and YouTube, as well as on podcast. Now, whether we agree with plant-based meats or not, it certainly is something that's not just happening here overseas. It's also starting to become quite a trend in New Zealand. And it is always fantastic to be able to keep an eye on what is going on around us, regardless of what part of the food system we work in. So that is why I'm looking forward to talking to Meadow Mushrooms chair and co-founder of Food Nation Nation, Miranda Burden, here on Serious Country's Changemaker. She shares her thoughts on why we should eat more plants for our bodies, the environment and our taste buds. But I really want to understand about Food Nation's journey and her learnings in producing plant-based meat lookalikes. I want to know her thoughts on our New Zealand red meat story and what it's like to capitalise on a food trend. So she will be joining me tomorrow. And an innovative dairy genetics company is focusing solely on developing heat-tolerant genetics in dairy cows. Thermoregulatory Genetics Chief Executive Derek Fairweather is going to explain how they are positioning dairy cows into a warmer future. North Canterbury's food and beverage producers came together to develop a unified brand that would offer them collaborative opportunities in marketing and promotion. And it is the very first food and beverage brand with 80 businesses on board. It's very cool. Enterprise North Canterbury Food and Development Manager Elisa Wilson shares what collaboration really means. And thank you to Annette Scott from Farmers Weekly for that story. And an inspiring story of an entrepreneurial Lincoln University agribusiness and food marketing student and Bayleys free range marketing and brand manager, Anna Craig, both a student and a marketing and brand manager collectively at the same time. She's going to share with us how she created her own food brand in her uni holidays and why she's having a crack at the free range industry. I'm most looking forward to speaking to this very inspiring 20-year-old, and I certainly can say I'm a proud consumer of her new free range eggs that have just hit the Lincoln New World shelves as well. So it's just incredible. It's always inspiring. Your change maker here on Serious Country every Wednesday, and of course on demand on podcast. If you've got any thoughts on the Opinion Maker show that you've just heard, please do email me, sarah@seriouscountry.com, so we can continue on the conversation around the matters that matter most to farming, food and fashion here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm also establishing a Facebook group to continue the conversation on the Serious Country Facebook page. So please, if you do have the time, come along and join the conversation within the Facebook group. And we will be able to develop the conversations that you want to hear more of into the future as well. So go to Serious Country Facebook page and look up the group called Serious Country Brains Trust. I want you on that and your thoughts at the table. Thank you so much for all of your time listening and watching wherever you are around the country and around the world. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Ka kite anō.